In 866, a former soldier took an abandoned military wagon and turned it into a kitchen on wheels. With it, he fed 20 cowboys for 3 months in the middle of nowhere. The menu? Biscuits with beetle larvae, rotting meat, coffee so thick you could chew it. Everything you think you know about food in the Old West comes from Hollywood, and now you're about to find out the reality of cowboy life. Fact 1. The moldy hardtack, biscuits with beetle larvae. Cowboys in the Old West didn't throw away moldy biscuits. They boiled them to kill the larvae and ate them anyway. Hardtack was made from flour, water, and salt, and it was the staple food on every trail drive that left Texas between 1860 and 1890. On 3 to 4 month trips along the Chisholm Trail or the Goodnight Loving Trail, hardtack would get infested with larvae from the Cytophilus granarius beetle. The standard solution from the cookie, the chuck wagon cook, was to dunk the biscuits in boiling coffee for a few minutes. The dead larvae would float to the top. The cowboy would scoop out the ones he could see, ignore the ones he couldn't, and eat it. The Union Army had already used the same method during the Civil War. Soldiers reported that the biscuits moved on their own when nobody was looking. When the food industry started producing vacuum-sealed biscuits in the early 20th century, homemade hardtack disappeared, along with the iron stomach it took to eat it. Hardtack is still made today as emergency and survival food. Without the larvae, we hope. But if your great-grandfather in the Old West saw the 25-year shelf life stamped on the modern package, he'd laugh. His hardtack lasted as long as the larvae let it. Fact 2. The salted meat that rotted. The meat your great-grandfather took on the trail often reached its destination in an advanced state of decay, and he ate it anyway. In the Old West, the salting process was primitive. No refrigeration, no temperature control, nothing. The salted beef and pork, packed in the chuck wagon barrels, often fermented during the 3 to 4 months of the great cattle drives between Texas and Dodge City, Kansas. Cowboys ate it anyway, because the alternative was not eating. The result was endemic dysentery among trail groups. Records from the time show that practically every cowboy who went on a long drive suffered at least one serious episode. Botulism, caused by improperly preserved meat, was already a silent killer in the 19th century. Botulism still kills hundreds of people a year in the U.S. Your great-grandfather in the Old West lived with that risk at every meal. The next time you smell meat in the fridge to see if it's still good, remember, he didn't have that luxury. Fact 3. Whiskey as anesthesia and drinking water. Whiskey wasn't something cowboys drank for fun. In the Old West, it was the only liquid that wouldn't kill you when the water was contaminated. In parts of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, where water sources were questionable, whiskey served as a safe drink. The alcohol killed some of the bacteria the water carried, but its most brutal use was as anesthesia. Field amputations, bullet removals, wound cauterizations, all of it was done with the patient drunk on whiskey until they passed out. Union Army surgeons during the Civil War documented hundreds of procedures using whiskey as the only painkiller. In Old West camps, with no surgeon at all, the chuck wagon cookie did the job with a bottle and a pair of pliers. Alcohol is still the cheapest and most accessible method of sterilization in emergency situations. Military field hospitals still use the same logic today. Your great-grandfather in the Old West already knew that. He just didn't know the name. Fact 4. The wild sourdough. The cook slept with the dough. Trail cooks in the Old West carried a sourdough starter that never got a break. And on cold nights on the Kansas and Nebraska plains, the cookie literally slept with it under his blanket to keep it at fermentation temperature. The sourdough starter was the most valuable thing in the chuck wagon, more important than the gun, more protected than the money. A starter that died meant weeks without bread for 20 men. And in the Old West, bread was the only thing that made trail food feel like real food. Some starters were years old, passed down from one cookie to the next like a professional inheritance. Charles Goodnight documented that his head cook kept the same starter for more than a decade on the Goodnight-loving trail. Sourdough starters, with more than 100 years of history, are still active in specialty bakeries in the U.S. Same technique, same process. The difference is that your great-grandfather in the Old West slept hugging the dough so it wouldn't freeze to death. Fact 5. The 3-day coffee. The thicker, the better. In the Old West, the same coffee could be reheated and drunk for 3 days straight. And the thicker it got, the more the cowboys liked it. Trail coffee was made in a kettle on the chuck wagon and never thrown out. New grounds were added to the old sludge day after day. The consistency got to the point where it was almost chewable. Cowboys on the great drives between Texas and Montana claimed that thick coffee stuck with you longer. And they were probably right, since the caffeine concentration multiplied with every reheating. The chuck wagon cookie woke up at 3 in the morning every day to make coffee before anything else. A cook who let the coffee run out before the cowboys woke up wouldn't last a week on the job. It was the one thing nobody forgave on the trail. To survive in the Old West, you needed skills, and I've compiled 50 of those techniques in a guide called The Lost Cowboy Code. If you want to truly learn how your great-grandfather did every one of those things, not just know they existed, but know how to do them, the link is in the first pinned comment. Fact 6. Beef tallow as butter. The butter substitute in the Old West was raw beef kidney fat, sweet, and it was used for absolutely everything. Frying beans, tallow. Greasing the bannock skillet, tallow. Waterproofing leather boots before crossing a river in Texas, tallow. Conditioning the leather on a hat, tallow. Moisturizing cracked skin on your hands, tallow. The chuck wagon cookie saved every ounce of kidney fat from every slaughtered steer like it was gold. Tallow was so central to life on the trail that cowboys who wasted animal fat were considered irresponsible. In the Old West economy, wasting fat was like throwing money away, because fat was money. It cooked, preserved, protected, and healed. Animal tallow has come back into fashion among fine dining chefs and carnivore diet followers, with premium packaging and artisanal pricing. Your great-grandfather in the Old West used the same product. He just didn't call it artisanal. He called it what we've got. Fact 7. Skillet bread with no yeast. Bannock, unleavened bread cooked in a cast-iron skillet, was the luxury dessert of the Old West Trail. Flour, water, salt, and animal fat, mixed and fried right in the chuck wagon skillet. No oven, no yeast, no resting time. The cowboy version was a dense, flat piece of bread with a rubbery texture. But after weeks of eating hardtack with larvae and rotting salted meat, fresh bannock was the ultimate comfort food available on the frontier. The technique came from the First Nations of Canada and moved down with fur traders to the plains of the Old West. A cookie who knew how to make good bannock was fought over by ranches, because the difference between a good and a bad trail cook was the difference between cowboys who stayed and cowboys who deserted. Bannock is still a traditional food among First Nations in Canada and at rodeos in the southern U.S. The recipe hasn't changed in 200 years. Your great-grandfather would recognize the taste. Fact 8. Snake meat as emergency protein. The rattlesnake wasn't just a danger in the Old West. It was dinner on bad nights. In the desert regions of Texas and Arizona, cowboys regularly reported hunting and eating rattlesnakes, vipers, and lizards. The meat was grilled right over the campfire coals. Trail Drive diaries from the 1870s described the taste as chicken-like, kinda like chicken, only tougher and with a fish-like texture. It wasn't about being exotic, it was pure necessity. When the cattle couldn't be slaughtered because they belonged to the owner of the drive, and when the salted meat in the barrel was already too rotten, even by Old West standards, any snake that crossed the camp became a meal. Rattlesnake meat is still eaten in the American Southwest at cultural festivals. The Rattlesnake Roundup in Sweetwater, Texas, serves fried rattlesnake to thousands every year. Your great-grandfather in the Old West didn't wait for the festival. He ate it when it showed up. Fact 9. Roasted grasshoppers as a snack. During the devastating grasshopper invasions that swept across the Great Plains in the 1870s and 1880s, destroying entire crops from Kansas to Dakota, cowboys and farmers in the Old West found an unexpected solution: eating the invaders. Grasshoppers were collected in sacks, roasted in cast-iron skillets on the chuck wagon, and eaten with salt as a protein snack. Native tribes in the region had already been doing exactly that for centuries, and they taught the technique to settlers, who lost everything to the plagues. The grasshopper invasion of 1874, which became known as the Year of the Grasshopper, destroyed $200 million in crops at the time. Anyone who didn't eat grasshoppers that year went hungry. Roasted grasshoppers are now a gourmet product sold in specialty markets in Mexico and the U.S. Same cooking technique, different packaging. Your great-grandfather would have thought it was crazy to pay for something that fell from the sky for free. Fact 10. Wild honey with larvae. In the Old West, cowboys' honey came from the whole nest, bee larvae included, and considered a protein bonus. When they found wild hives in the woods of Texas, Oklahoma, or Missouri, cowboys destroyed the entire nest to collect the honey. The larvae were eaten along with the honeycomb. Diaries from the time described it as crunchy and sweet, crunchy and sweet. There was no separating honey from insect. Everything went together. Extra protein with no waste, exactly the Old West mindset, where nothing edible was thrown away. Insect larvae are still eaten around the world as a protein source. The FAO supports insects as a solution for global food security. Your great-grandfather in the Old West was already doing that. He just didn't know he was being sustainable. Fact 11. Cornmeal with sand. Cornmeal in Old West camps had an extra texture nobody asked for: fine sand mixed in during transport. The sacks of flour stored in the chuck wagon were constantly contaminated with dust and sand from the Old West trails. Sifting was a hassle and was often skipped by the cookie, especially on long drives where time was short and hunger was urgent. The result was literally marked in history. Archaeological finds of 19th century cowboy skeletons showed dental wear consistent with the regular consumption of abrasive foods. The sand ground down the teeth of an entire generation of frontier men. Here's the ironic part. Almost everything the Old West cowboy ate out of desperation, today's food industry sells as a premium product. Bone broth, $10 a cup in New York. Pemmican, $15 on a bar. Raw milk, $15 on a gallon. Beef tallow, artisanal. What used to be survival became marketing. Fact 12. Pemmican copied from the natives. The energy bar of the Old West was a Native American invention that cowboys copied and made worse. The original pemmican, developed by the tribes of the Great Plains over centuries, combined dried ground meat, bison fat, and wild berries like service berries and cranberries. It was nutritionally complete. Arctic explorers survived for months eating nothing but pemmican. Cowboys in the Old West adopted a simplified version, just dried meat and beef tallow without the berries. They lost essential nutrients in the process. Scurvy, caused by a vitamin C deficiency, was common among cowboys who relied on the incomplete version. The irony is that the original native recipe was better in every way. Modern pemmican bars, sold for $8 to $5 each, are considered superfoods. The original native version was more nutritious than anything you'll find on the shelf today. Your great-grandfather in the Old West ate the worst version and still survived. Fact 13. Bone broth boiled for 24 hours. When the meat ran out in Old West camps, cowboys boiled the bones until they turned to gelatin. Beef bones saved after the meat was eaten were thrown into the chuck wagon kettle and boiled for 12 to 24 hours to pull out marrow, collagen, and fat. The result was a thick, greasy broth eaten as a full meal. Nothing went to waste. The bone went into the fire until it had nothing left to give. It was the last stop before real hunger. When even the bones had already been boiled, the next step was hunting snake or roasting grasshoppers. A cookie who knew how to get the most out of every bone was gold in the Old West. Bone broth became a wellness phenomenon in the U.S., sold for $10 a cup in New York cafes, using the exact same process as the 19th century chuck wagon. Fact 14. Vinegar as a universal preservative. In the Old West, vinegar wasn't a condiment. It was the only affordable preservative for almost everything eaten on the trail. Vegetables in vinegar, meats marinated in vinegar, fruits preserved in vinegar. The chuck wagon always carried barrels of apple cider vinegar. It was just as essential as water and coffee. The acidity slowed bacterial growth, a mechanism Old West cowboys understood through experience without understanding the chemistry. Nobody knew what pH was back then, but every cookie knew that meat in vinegar lasted longer than meat without it. It was pure hands-on science, tested in the field, confirmed by hunger. Vinegar fermentation has come back into the mainstream as probiotic food, the same 19th century preservation technology with modern health claims and an artisanal product price tag. Fact 15. Turtle eggs as a luxury. Finding a turtle nest on the Old West Trail was like striking gold. The eggs were eaten raw when there was no time for a fire, or boiled directly using the turtle's shell as a pot and the animal's own fat as fuel. For cowboys who hadn't seen a chicken egg in weeks, desert turtle eggs were an absolute delicacy. There were no regulations at all in the Old West. If it was on the ground and edible, it was food. The turtle, the eggs, the fat, everything was used. The zero-waste mindset wasn't an environmental philosophy. It was hunger. The desert tortoise is now a protected species in the U.S. What your great-grandfather in the Old West ate freely is now a federal crime. Times have changed. The survival instinct hasn't. The Old West cowboy wasn't grossed out, not because he was rough, because being grossed out is a luxury for people who have options. When the only alternative is not eating, everything becomes food. Fact 16. Tobacco as a hunger suppressant. When food ran out on the Old West Trail, cowboys chewed tobacco to suppress hunger. It wasn't addiction. It was a survival technique used by entire armies. Chewing tobacco was a standard item in the kit of every cowboy who went out on a drive. Nicotine suppresses appetite and boosts alertness, a property known through experience by frontier men and later confirmed by science. On days with no game, when the chuck wagon supplies ran out and the next resupply point was days away on the Kansas or Nebraska plains, tobacco was the meal. Cowboys reported chewing nonstop for 2 to 3 days straight when the food was gone. Nicotine as an appetite suppressant is still studied by the pharmaceutical industry for obesity treatment. Your great-grandfather in the Old West figured out the mechanism without knowing the name. Fact 17. Water filtered through a hat. When the water was too muddy in the rivers and ponds of the Old West, your great-grandfather filtered it through the brim of his hat before drinking it. With no portable filters, improvised filtration was standard in the Old West. The felt of the hat trapped solid particles, sand, mud, animal debris. Then the water went over the fire whenever possible. But a lot of the time, that wasn't possible. The water was drunk straight after passing through the hat. And the result was predictable. Typhoid and cholera were endemic among cowboys, who relied on unboiled water sources. Medical records from the time show that waterborne diseases killed more cowboys than any shootout. Today, portable gravity filters, inspired by the same logic, are standard on survival expeditions. The difference is that a modern filter costs $50. Your great-grandfather's hat cost a month's wages, and he used it for everything: sun, rain, filter, and pillow. Fact 18. Warm raw milk, straight from the cow. When there were cows in the Old West convoy, the milk was drunk straight after milking, warm, unpasteurized, immediately. Cows were occasionally taken on drives to provide fresh milk. But with no refrigeration in the chuck wagon, the milk was only safe for the first 30 minutes after milking. Any delay meant sour milk. And the sour milk was drunk too. It caused frequent cramps, but it was better than having no source of calcium and fat at all. Cowboys who had access to fresh milk on the trail were considered privileged. Most went entire months without seeing a drop. Raw milk is now a premium product in U.S. states where it's legal, sold for $15 a gallon in organic markets. The same product that made cowboys sick in the Old West is sold as natural and ancestral food. Your great-grandfather would find that ironic. Fact 19. Boiled fatback is the base of everything. Fatback, or salt pork, was the ingredient that went into absolutely every trail meal in the Old West. Sweet, salty, or plain, it didn't matter. Salt pork was boiled, and the rendered fat was used to fry everything else in the chuck wagon: beans, bread, eggs when available, vegetables when they existed. The same piece of fatback could be a source of flavor and fat for entire weeks before it was completely used up. The chuck wagon cookie didn't waste a single gram of pork fat. Every drop was reused for frying, waterproofing, lamp fuel, and as the base for medicinal poultices. In the Old West, pork fat was a bargaining chip as much as money. Lard was declared a nutritional villain in the 1950s and replaced with hydrogenated vegetable oils. Half a century later, science showed that the trans fat in industrial oils was worse. Lard came back to artisanal kitchens as a natural fat. Your great-grandfather in the Old West never stopped using it. Fact 20. The two-day beans. Slow food. Before the name existed, cowboy beans in the Old West weren't cooked in a few hours. They took 2 full days to become edible. The dried black beans in the chuck wagon required 12 hours of soaking, followed by 8 or more hours of slow cooking over trail coals. Without that time, they were inedible. And without beans, there was no plant-based protein at all in the frontier diet. The cookies started preparing Tuesday's beans to eat on Thursday. Without the proper cooking time, the beans caused severe cramps that cowboys called prairie madness, a nickname that hid the real suffering of men doubled over in pain in the middle of nowhere. Beans are still the most commonly eaten food in rural Brazil, and the U.S. today's slow food methods reproduce exactly that necessary slowness. Your great-grandfather in the Old West was already doing slow food, just not by choice, out of necessity. Fact 21. Shrub tea as medicine, desert pharmacy. For stomach aches, fever, and infected wounds in the Old West, the remedy was tea boiled from whatever shrub was available in the desert. With no access to pharmacies, the nearest one could be hundreds of miles away. Old West cowboys turned to improvised herbal knowledge. Artemisia, sagebrush, wild licorice root, and mesquite bark were boiled into medicinal teas in the chuck wagon. Some worked because of natural antibiotic action. Others were harmless. They did neither good nor bad, and some probably made things worse. The cowboy had no way of knowing. He drank it, waited, and hoped. It was trial and error medicine, in the most literal sense. Artemisia, used by cowboys on instinct, contains artemisinin, the basis of modern anti-malarial drugs. discovered only in 1972 by Chinese scientist Tu Youyou, who won the Nobel Prize for it. Your great-grandfather in the Old West was using the right plant without knowing why. Science took another century to confirm it. Fact 22. The Chuck Wagon as a mobile hospital. This is the last fact, because it sums up everything this list represents. The Chuck Wagon cook in the Old West wasn't just a cook. He was a doctor, dentist, surgeon, and pharmacist, using the same skillet for everything. The cookie pulled teeth with blacksmith pliers, cauterized wounds with a hot iron from the stove, made poultices out of cooked beans for inflammation. The kitchen space and the surgery space were literally the same place in the Old West. The Chuck Wagon, invented by Charles Goodnight in 1866 in Texas, was the first multifunctional vehicle in American history. Kitchen, pharmacy, storage room, workshop, and hospital, all in one mule-drawn wagon. Every drawer had a purpose. Every shelf was optimized. It was survival engineering on wheels. The multifunctionality of the Chuck Wagon cook was a direct precursor to modern paramedics. Your great-grandfather in the Old West was treated by the same man who fried his beans. And that man, with a skillet and a pair of pliers, kept 20 cowboys alive for months on end in the most unforgiving territory in America.